Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 775 for July 7th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
I don't care what kind of business you start, it's always that first, 3+ years are scary. I mean, it's definitely taking that first step off that cliff, if you will. We knew that it would be a difficult few years, but to be honest, it really tested. The year 3 and 4 were hard. I mean, they were really hard because we were already like, okay, we've been doing this for 3 years, and then things just sort of started to turn the corner.
Ann Marshall and Scott Blackwell founded High Wire Distilling 6 years ago in Charleston, South Carolina. Now they're taking the next step in their journey. They're moving the distillery to a new building several blocks away with 4 times the space for both distilling equipment and an expanded tasting room, while bucking the trend among craft distillers to team up with a bigger partner. I'll talk with them later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with the calendar of events, your voice, and much more. All on this edition of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. It took 4 days, but a fire at one of Jim Beam's maturation warehouses in Kentucky has finally burned itself out. The fire started late Tuesday night in one of the warehouses on the site of the former Old Crow Distillery near Versailles, Kentucky. The warehouse held 45,000 barrels of bourbon, according to Beam Suntory spokesman, and Woodford County Emergency Management Director Drew Chandler told us on Friday spilled whiskey filled the basement substructure below the warehouse as the barrels broke open.
The decision to burn off the distillate, of course, came from recommendations from state and federal environmental officials to the county fire department. And there's less damage being done allowing it to burn than there would be pouring water on it and any runoff making it in to the creek and downstream to the river, which is used as a drinking water source for communities downstream.
Unfortunately, a lot of whiskey did make it into Glens Creek, which runs alongside the Old Crow site, and from there it flowed into the Kentucky River and could reach the Ohio River soon. State environmental officials are still evaluating the impact, but say thousands of fish have already died along more than 20 miles of river. No one was hurt in the fire, despite the intense heat that Chandler compared to fighting an airport fire with burning jet fuel.
The miraculous job of our county's ambulance service personnel making sure that the firefighters were not actively fighting fire for more than a few minutes at a time, and then rotating them out and back in when their vital signs and hydration had occurred, contributed to no heat exhaustion injuries, which is a serious medical emergency. But through all of this, nobody's gotten hurt. And I attribute that to the professional service and the continuing education that everybody goes through and taking training seriously.
There's no word yet on what caused the fire, though initial reports indicate that lightning is a potential cause. There were thunderstorms in the area late Tuesday night. The fire spread briefly to a second warehouse, but firefighters were able to stop that fire before it caused extensive damage. Beam Suntory's predecessor company, American Brands, acquired the Old Crow Distillery and its warehouses in 1987, and while the distillery was closed at that time, Beam has continued to use the warehouses ever since. The company says the warehouse and its contents were insured, but has not given any estimates on the value of the lost whiskey or whether a new rickhouse will be built at the site. This is the second incident involving a maturation warehouse in Kentucky in the past month. Cleanup work continues at the O.Z. Tyler Distillery in Owensboro following the partial collapse of a rickhouse June 17th. We'll have more on this story as it develops at whiskeycast.com. In other news, the Trump administration is looking at more whiskey tariffs, this time on Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, and whiskies from all European Union member nations. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative announced Monday that it's recommending those whiskies be added to a list of European imports proposed back in April that included wines, brandies, liqueurs, and non-alcoholic beers. The tariffs are in response to a long-running dispute between the U.S. and Europe over subsidies for Airbus and Boeing. Robert Marin oversees international trade issues for the Distilled Spirits Council.
This has been going on for 14 years. The EU has a parallel case against the U.S. for civil aviation subsidies that the state of Washington and I believe it's Washington and the federal government provides to Boeing. Both the U.S. and the EU have been found to be acting in a manner incompatible, in violation of the World Trade Organization obligations. Just the U.S. case is about 9 months ahead of the EU case, which means that, if the U.S. and the EU go through and follow the WTO procedures, which they are in this case, the U.S. would be authorized to impose additional tariffs on EU products about 9 months before the EU will be able to impose additional tariffs on U.S. products. So it's, moving through the multilateral trading regime as opposed to unilateral actions taken by the Trump administration in the steel and aluminum tariffs, which resulted in the EU applying the 25% retaliatory tariff on American whiskey. But the impact on our industry would just compound. I mean, they're separate, but the impact would be, if the U.S. and the EU were to move through the WTO process and place tariffs on American and EU or, EU and U.S. imports of EU products, and the EU was to do the similar on U.S. products, it would just compound the negative impact that our industry is already facing because of the 25% tariff on American whiskey to the EU.
Marin says the council looked at the economic impact on the U.S. spirits industry for the original set of tariffs and projected that a 25% tariff could lead to the loss of 15,000 U.S. jobs at importers, distributors, and retailers. And adding whiskeys to that list would make what he called the unintended consequences even worse. The Council, along with its counterparts in Scotland, Ireland, and the rest of Europe, are all urging politicians on both sides to dial back the trade war. Keep in mind that the U.S. is the largest export market by value for Scotch whiskey, and for Irish whiskey, it's the largest market, period. Also, we reported last month that the Treasury Department's Tax and Trade Bureau was working on a proposed regulation change for bottle sizes. At the time, no definite date had been set for publishing the proposal. That changed this week. The proposal to eliminate all but a minimum and maximum bottle size for whiskeys and other distilled spirits is now on the table, along with a similar one for wines. The public comment period is open through August 30th, and if the proposed changes go into effect, it would open up the U.S. market to the 700-milliliter bottles that are standard in Europe and many other parts of the world. Let's talk about new whiskeys now, and the return of one. Several years ago, Chivas Brothers pulled the Glenlivet 12-year-old out of many global markets and replaced it with the no-age statement Founder's Reserve because of supply shortages. At the time, Chivas Brothers said it hoped to bring the 12-year-old back when stocks got back to normal. That is now happening, as the 12-year-old is back on shelves in the UK and several other markets. Meanwhile, the Glenlivet Enigma is now available in many markets as well. It's the fourth edition in master distiller Alan Winchester's annual series of mystery whiskies. As he told us, the idea is to taste a whiskey with no preconceived notions.
You're looking at the whiskey to see what you can find, what you can identify, write your own tasting notes. We had great fun the last time we did that interactive thing where you could test out your tasting notes against the team's tasting notes, which is always good fun.
As with the previous three editions, Enigma comes in a black bottle, and they'll release the details on it, along with Alan's tasting notes, at the end of the year. Glenmorangie is releasing the fourth bottling in its Bond House No. 1 Vintage collection. The Grand Vintage Malt 1991 combines malts finished in Oloroso sherry and Burgundy wine casks. It has a recommended U.S. retail price of $750 a bottle. Glenallachie is releasing its first set of cask-finished single malts. There's a 12-year-old Pedro Jimenez sherry cask finish, a 10-year-old Portwood finish, and an 8-year-old single malt that's finished in quarter-size rye whiskey casks from Koval Distillery in Chicago. The 8 and 10-year-olds will carry a recommended retail price of £54.99 in the UK. That's around $69 US. The 12-year-old will be priced at £58.99. That's about $74 a bottle. Diageo is coming out with the oldest official bottling of Talisker yet. It's a 41-year-old whiskey that will be the second bottling in the Talisker Bodega series and is finished in Manzanilla sherry casks from Delgado's Leta. The price tag, £2,900 a bottle. That's about $3,632 at current exchange rates. Meanwhile, Johnny Walker is releasing a new travel retail series aimed at deconstructing some of the blending process for its flagship Black Label, while highlighting the flavor profiles from Scotland's different whiskey regions. The Black Label Origins series has 4 different whiskies created with malts from Speyside, the Highlands, and Islay, while the fourth uses malts and grain whiskies from the Lowlands. Each one will sell for around $46 in travel retail. Distell has unveiled its 2019 limited release collection with malts from Bunnahabhain, Deanston, and Tobermory. There are 8 whiskies in the range, including a Bunnahabhain 1988 Marsala cask finish and a 2002 Deanston Organic single malt that's matured in Oloroso sherry casks. Pricing ranges from £90 a bottle to £450, and the whiskies will be available globally, with 6 of the 8 to be available in the U.S. On the American whiskey front, Sazerac's Barton 1792 distillery is out with its latest limited edition release. 1792 aged 12 years will become an annual release. It uses the same rye forward mash bill as the regular 1792 small batch bourbon. It'll sell for about $50 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at whiskycast.com. WhistlePig Rye's latest Farm Stock edition is the final version in the Farm Stock trilogy. Crop number 3 is also a milestone for the folks at WhistlePig Farm in Vermont, since it is the first WhistlePig bottling where most of the whiskey came from the farm's distillery. 52%, in fact, while the rest is a combination of 31% 6-year-old rye and 17% 10-year-old rye from Alberta distillers in Canada. It'll sell for $72.99 a bottle. Denver's Laws Whiskey House has bottled what it claims is the first bottled-in-bond wheat whiskey. It's distilled from 100% Colorado-grown soft white spring wheat, and as with all bottled-in-bond whiskeys, it's at least 4 years old from a single distilling season and bottled at 50% ABV. It'll be available at the distillery in Denver and at Colorado retailers. No word on pricing. Finally, there's a new distillery in western Pennsylvania on the site of a much older one. West Overton Village near Pittsburgh is located on the Overholt family's estate and was the home of Overholt Rye up until Prohibition. Now, an educational distillery is open at the village, complete with a 50-gallon pot still. They're starting slowly with help from some of the area's craft distillers, and may eventually have some aged rye available to sell. Think of it as a much smaller version of George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon in Virginia, which was also restored as an educational distillery. And by the way, Mount Vernon recently started selling some of its 4-year-old rye at the estate's gift shop. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Keeping American whiskey history and tradition alive isn't just a marketing slogan. It's part of Heaven Hill's fabric. When other distillers were getting out of the rye whiskey business, Heaven Hill saved the legendary Rittenhouse rye from becoming a footnote in the history books. Today, it's the rye whiskey of choice, in a cocktail or neat, with a distinct spicy flavor all its own. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Proof Washington Distillers Festival is this coming Saturday in Seattle, Washington, along with the Beer, Bourbon, Barbecue, and Blues Festival at the NAV Center in Cornwall, Ontario. Tales of the Cocktail takes over New Orleans from the 16th through the 21st, along with the New Orleans Indie Spirits Expo on the 20th. Washington, D.C.'s National Press Club hosts the Spirits of America Craft Spirits Tasting July 23rd. The Only Whiskey Show is on the 25th and 26th in Sandton, South Africa. Whiskey Live Perth is July 26th and 27th in Australia. For you Harry Potter fans, Wands and Whiskey is on the 30th in Philadelphia. Whiskey Fringe 2019 is August 9th through the 11th in Edinburgh, Scotland, and Tasmanian Whiskey Week runs from August 11th through the 18th in Australia. Right now, we have 212 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a festival, a tasting, or any other whiskey-related event coming up, just use the contact form on the website to let us know about it, and we'll add it to the list.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. A couple of years ago, I was in Charleston, South Carolina for BevCon and visited High Wire Distilling. Scott Blackwell and Ann Marshall founded the distillery 6 years ago. They make gin, vodka, and an Amaro liqueur, along with their whiskeys, including a Jimmy Red bourbon made from the South Carolina Jimmy Red corn. This week they announced plans to invest $3 million to move their distillery just a few blocks away to a new site that has 4 times the space. They're also bucking the trend of small-scale distillers to team up with larger companies and will stay independent. Why expand the distillery now? Is this to meet future demand? Are you already finding shortfalls in stocks, or what's going on?
A little bit of both. We've got, looking at next year with current trajectory, we're shorter than we'd like to be. And so, as you are well aware, whiskey takes time. So we've got to get out ahead of the curve. We're about a year behind, actually, on this move. We looked around downtown. It's tough with a peninsula. You got water on three sides and, limited amount of real estate. And with Charleston booming like it is, it's been pretty difficult to find a decent-sized space and stay downtown.
And you're right on the outskirts of downtown as it is, right?
Yeah.
We are on what was the outskirts of town when we moved here 6 years ago. And since that time, it has just exploded past us. So we found ourselves getting pretty quickly leapfrogged by restaurants and bars and that food and beverage community just moving further up the peninsula, chasing those lower rents, and really expanding the peninsula, I would say, by 10 more blocks as far as downtown goes.
Yeah, Mark, you wouldn't recognize the place. The hotels, there are multiple new hotels being built, and I don't know how many apartments, thousands of new apartments. There are cranes kind of everywhere up where we are now. It's getting crowded.
So for us, we needed a space. We're currently in about 6,600 square feet, which was a lot when we opened. We thought that was pretty big, and now we've got barrels really all over the place, and we don't have a loading dock, so that's always been a difficulty for us, and the complex that we're in has just become busier and busier. So it's hard to get a full-size truck through the parking lot these days, and then to have to unload from the parking lot is a hassle. So we're really excited about having a loading dock and having some barrel storage space. For a minute, we thought we were going to have to set up an off-site warehouse, which would have created a big burden as far as transportation, and also just paying rent on a building that isn't that pretty, just stores the barrels. So this is actually really, really good. As Scott said, we're a little behind schedule on the move, but I think we'll move just in the nick of time.
It's about 4 blocks north of where we are now. It's a street called Yuji. So we're on King Street, which is kind of the main artery up the peninsula, and you just go up King about 3 blocks and take a right on Yuji, and we're right there. So it's 22,000 square feet that we're moving into, with 22-foot ceilings and dock height. And there's this new low line, a bike and walking path that's being put in by the city in the coming future, and that's going to be right beside the building. We just decided, with our growth and with some changes in laws, expanding the tasting room, taking advantage of the move, expanding the tasting room, getting a second still, a much larger still dedicated to whiskey production, having increased barrel storage, a little bit more flow of production as well. Where we are, everything kind of goes in the door and out the door right through the middle of production. This new facility will be able to avoid that a little bit more.
I'm getting the sense that a lot of the small-scale distillers that started up 5-10 years ago are in the same situation you guys are in terms of having outgrown your original space, or being in a position where it doesn't make sense to stay in the current location and you've got to find a new place to move it to. Is this sort of the same sense you have? Is this a good thing in that we're seeing so much growth in craft distilling that everybody's having to go to Distillery 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's happened is, the early craft distillers obviously have grown, and a lot of them have been sold and moved on or continued to grow. And then there was this huge wave, as you know, of craft distilleries opening. I think when we were originally looking to open this business, there were about 200 distilleries in the U.S. And with that wave of those other 1,500 that have opened since, within that, I think some folks that were starting back in that era where we were beginning have actually started to find their footing and put out better products. And I think that, that the consumers are responding, and so I think it's here to stay. I mean, I think it's not a fad. I think it's more of a trend. And so I think that what we're seeing is a reflection of something that was wanted and needed by consumers. It's some fresh blood and some new offerings in the market, and maybe a different way of bringing things to market that hadn't been available before. I always tell people that we're sort of slowly recovering from Prohibition still, and spirits really are kind of the last bastion. We had wine, and then beer, cider, and then now spirits. And if you look at it, during the Industrial Revolution and Prohibition and that whole period, the country was really huge growth mode, and then there was this big speed bump of Prohibition. And when you looked around the country pre-Prohibition, there were little distilleries and breweries and wineries all over the country, and we lost that. So I think it's a natural thing to get that back. And so I'm not totally surprised. I'm happy. We were a little worried about it when we started, whether there would be a longevity to this whole craft distilling movement.
You were worried when you started out, and yet you went ahead with it, knowing that it was going to be several years before you'd have product to sell? That takes some courage, or maybe some stubbornness.
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, I don't care what kind of business you start. It's always that first, 3+ years are scary. I mean, it's definitely taking that first step off that cliff, if you will. We knew that it would be a difficult few years, but to be honest, it really tested. The year 3 and 4 were hard. I mean, they were really hard because we were already like, okay, we've been doing this for 3 years, and then things just sort of started to turn the corner in late year 4 and 5. We're going on 6 now. We'll be 6 in September. And the steps don't end. I mean, this next step is a huge step for us. We're taking yet another leap. We had a great couple of years and have proven out what we feel like is going to be our future direction. And then yet, having to take another step and go out and get some more money and buy some more equipment and hire some more folks. And it's exciting, but at the same time, it's stressful for sure.
I can imagine. How hard was it to find the financing to do the expansion?
We've been pretty lucky. We actually have been pretty conservative throughout the life of the company, and really kept things tight. And we have the occasional cash flow shortages, but at the end of the day, we're usually right at profitable or on the profitable side of things. And so we've had several options with financing that we were able to choose from. So we've been fortunate that it's not free, but we're excited that we were able to get some support from one of our local banks that we've been working with from day one. We also got some assistance from the county and city of Charleston, and some incentives and things of that nature that are definitely going to help us out. We had, it's just like any puzzle. At the end of the day, there's a bottom line, and all these financial pieces need to make sense. And we believe with having an expanding tasting room, we'll have an event space on site, and then that expanded ability to make more product are all opportunities. Not, they're liabilities, but they're also opportunities. Our tasting room, we got a law passed about 2 years ago that we could make cocktails, and it has really increased our sales, and it has afforded us some additional staffing, and there are a lot of days where the tasting room, you've been in there, it's not a huge tasting room, but it gets really crowded and there's no seats. So we're looking to, I think, be somewhere around 3 times the size of what we are right now, with some more bar seating, and then also some off-bar seating, with a little bit more room to kind of hang out and sort of not feel like you're in the way, like right now, like it does when it gets crowded. So I think that additional uptick in revenue would be nice, and then this event space will also give us some additional flow. So when we were looking at the projections, long story short, when we were looking at the projections of the bank, we had a model that looked at all of those pieces. So it's a multi-pronged approach as opposed to just, wholesale sales, and that's it. So we really, that's one of the main reasons we decided to stay in downtown Charleston versus being 10 miles outside of Charleston. We could have gotten a piece of land out in the country and built a metal building and, kept things super cheap, but then we get almost no revenue from tasting room, and then obviously an event space would be out of the question. So we're looking at those as real opportunities to help us pay some bills, but also to be able to tell the story to visitors. We get 7 million visitors a year in Charleston, so we want to make sure we take advantage of that.
And you've also been able to stay independent through this. A lot of your colleagues have had to team up with the big boys of the industry. How often do you guys get calls about this from the larger companies wanting to team up with you or take you over, as it were?
We have gotten a lot of interest, to be honest. It's always flattering. Scott and I are determined to stick it out as long as we can. Just the two of us. Unfortunately, like Scott said, we have a great bank partner that's really stretched their philosophy to support us in a lot of ways. At one point, we were talking to West Coast banks about establishing a line of credit against our liquid inventory, and our southeastern banks said, give us a minute, we're going to try to figure this out, and they did, and so we have really had a lot of support from them. But yeah, there's been a lot of inbound interest, and we're always happy to talk to people. We're always interested in knowing what is happening in that arena, but really determined to keep it private as long as we can.
But you face the distribution hassle if you don't, of being able to get into all the stores you could get into and the bars.
There's certainly benefits to having a strategic partner. I think that for now, we, because our whiskey stocks are fairly limited, we are just trying to be protective of that and protective of the customers that have been really loyal to us from the beginning. And while we're still small and boutique, it's been good for us to just have really steady strategic growth, not quite ready for that spike in distribution, I would say, from a brand standpoint in a lot of ways. So it's definitely a controlled growth model. I'm not going to say that time will never come, because I do think that there are so many benefits of having a partner like that. But for now, it's really nice to just keep it tight and have a limited number of voices in the company that can allow us to really grow deep roots with our brand and our philosophy and continue to grow in a really deliberate way.
So when do we see the next batch of Jimmy Red come out?
We are bottling consistently right now. It's definitely on the pallet, out the door situation. So but it's consistently being released. We just are, like I say, being pretty quiet about it, so we don't outpace what we have as far as demand goes, which is just a controlled growth philosophy right now, and making sure that we aren't creating a lot of frustration in the market, which we experienced last year for sure.
Well, the great thing that we've had with Jimmy Red lately is for the first 2 years, we would have 2 barrels or 3 barrels or 4 barrels come around at the same time in maturity. And so our blends were pretty basic. You know, when you're blending 2 barrels or 3 barrels, it's like, well, there's not a whole lot of decisions to make there, nor can you don't have a whole lot of leeway. Lately, we've been able to pull 18, 20 barrels at a time, look through those and assess. And so our blends have gotten to be, where we're blending 7 to 9 barrels at a time, which has been hugely liberating. So our whole intention is just to make that product better and better. We don't feel like, it's ever where we want it to be exactly. So we just always want to try to continue bettering it. And at the same time, we've been skipping over some barrels to get some more age on some additional stock. So that's been intentional. I mean, like you and I talked about when you were down, we chose not to source whiskey early on, and it's a painful decision. I think for us, it's been the right thing because it's our story and we own what we have. But at the same time, you have this sort of challenging, scary battle of putting your name on something that you've made from scratch, and it's a tough road. So Jimmy Red, luckily, in my opinion, has just gotten better and better. I think we're on batch 13 or 14, and I think it's the best we've made yet. So,
did you guys get anything new in the works? Any other new product?
We can tease you a little bit. We've got a new to us grain that we are doing a seed increase on this summer that we hope we'll get lucky with the weather. We're in our second drought of the summer, and the corn stalks are really struggling down here. But our Jimmy Red is okay. But the seed increase is happening at a private farm down near Walterboro, South Carolina, and it's being babied like no other. I think the last text we got from the farmer said that he was keeping animals away via a disco ball. And what was the music selection, Scott? It was something very random, maybe some Aerosmith or something.
Irish Spring Soap.
And Irish Spring Soap was the other deterrent that was being used. So it's a very precious amount of acreage that we're trying to keep alive so we can start on the path of reviving yet another grain. And we're really, really excited about this one.
Boy, between drought and hurricanes, you guys just seem to get it all down there, don't you?
Yeah, it's a wild, when we had our team retreat in February and did our SWOT analysis, we definitely had climate all over the threats and weaknesses boxes. It's tough. We are really making an effort this year to diversify the locations of our farms. We're going to probably sign on 2 more farms in 2020 that are a little further inland, that have a little bit of a different climate pattern. But yes, South Carolina, and I would say coastal Southeast, is just getting pummeled.
Well, I mean, look at the country. I mean, look at the Midwest with all that rain. They couldn't even plant a lot of their corn this year. You know, I think there's been a big issue with that. So I think the only way we would guarantee that we would really diversify is to plant in another hemisphere, you know, and
which is not out of the question.
Yeah, but yeah, we're going inland a little bit more. We're not on the super coast areas for some of the farms, and then we're also working with some geneticists and scientists on seed security. So we're doing some controlled seed increases and things of that nature, just really trying to get our structure together, because this new facility will allow us to produce about 5 times what we can produce now. So we can lay down with one shift, 5 days a week, about 1,000 barrels a year. And that'll mean that we're growing somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.2 to 1.4 million pounds of grain. So it's going to be really important to obviously have our structure tightened up.
The new distillery will open early next year, and the biggest part, it'll create 45 new jobs in the process. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with an experiment. I've mentioned Charbet Distillery's R5 Firehouse whiskey a couple of times in recent weeks. It's distilled from Bear Republic Brewing's Racer 5 IPA beer, and the latest batch, lot number 5, is raising money to help victims of last fall's Northern California wildfires. There are not many whiskeys out there distilled from fully hopped beer, and this gives us a chance to compare the beer to the whiskey that came from it. Charbet sent me a sample of R5, and I was able to find Bear Republic's Racer 5 IPA at a local store to be able to taste them side by side. The beer, as you might expect from an IPA, is hoppy and aromatic, with a nice touch of bitterness and hints of cocoa. The whiskey is bottled at 49.5% ABV, but even after distilling and several years of maturation, the beer's character still comes through. The nose is hoppy with notes of caramel, pipe tobacco, muted spices, and hints of grilled fruits. The taste has a nice complexity, with black pepper spiciness balanced by hops, brown sugar, caramel, and charred oak. The finish is long with a good balance of hops and sweetness, and if you added some pepperiness to an IPA, that's exactly what you'd find on the finish. Now, it's not going to be to everyone's taste, but that's okay. I don't rate beers, but I'm scoring Charbet's R5 Firehouse whiskey a 91. Sagamore Spirits Double Oak takes 4-year-old rye whiskey and puts it into a fresh barrel for an extra boost. It's bottled at 48.3% ABV. The nose has baking spices, honey, caramel, molasses, and just a hint of leather. The taste is spicy with clove, black pepper, and chili powder notes that fade slowly to reveal honey, caramel, brown sugar, and hints of tree fruits. The finish is mouth-watering with hints of spice, tree fruits, honey, and caramel. I'm scoring the Sagamore Spirit Double Oak a 92. Basil Hayden's Caribbean Reserve Rye from Beam Suntory is finished in rum casks. It's bottled at 40% ABV, and the nose has notes of brown sugar, molasses, charred oak, caramel, and subtle spices. The taste starts off sweet at first, with a delayed burst of spices as black pepper and cinnamon complement brown sugar and caramel, but the spices fade away to leave the sweetness behind on the finish. I'm scoring the Basil Hayden's Caribbean Reserve Rye an 88. And finally, let's look at the single malts of Scotland Glentocher's 1997 single cask bottling. It's from Elixir Distillers, and this 21-year-old Speyside single malt was bottled at 54.1% ABV. The nose is aromatic and warm with spicy touches of ginger and allspice, along with a touch of lemon zest and a nice maltiness. The taste has white pepper, coriander, and crystallized ginger spices, balanced by almond oil, dark chocolate, and a hint of toffee. The finish is long with lingering touches of ginger, cocoa, almond oil, and dark chocolate. I'm scoring it a 92. I'm adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of more than 2,600 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at whiskycast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Grab a bourbon and settle into a good story. Heaven Hill's backroom stories, told by those who've rarely shared before just how they shape the spirit and just how the spirit shapes them.
All the barrels are aging here. A lot of the airflow through the warehouse like this, when you open the door, all that goodness hits you in the face. And, it's something you never forget.
Download and listen to the new podcast, Tales from the Hill, from Heaven Hill Distillery. It's coming soon to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. Lots of comments on the latest round in the trade war. Found Art Whiskey in Sweden posted this comment on Instagram, which will lead to more tariffs on American goods in the EU, which will lead to, can't we just send the politicians to bed without their supper? Bourbon prices already went up 8% in Sweden, which is sad, as bourbon sales were increasing 8% year over year. Will be interesting to see the 2019 numbers when they come out. Good point. It might be interesting. It might also be a bit scary. I mentioned the head-to-head comparison between Charbet's R5 whiskey and Bear Republic's Racer 5 IPA the other night on Twitter. And as I figured, I'm not the first person to try this combination. Ionosaurus tweeted this: "The flavor carries over quite a bit. Definitely a hoppy whiskey. I liked it, but still prefer the Racer 5 as a beer and traditional whiskey as whiskey. Thanks for the feedback." Now, before our next comment, I want to take you back to last week's interview with David DeFazio of Wyoming Whiskey for a minute on the origins of their Outrider, somewhat rye whiskey.
Steve Nally came from Maker's Mark, and he was a wheated bourbon maker, and that's what he believed was the way to make bourbon. And when, we're talking almost 10 years ago now, I approached him and asked him, to see what he would think about making a rye, because the trade publications had started to indicate there was a little bit of a blip, like people were getting interested in this. And as you know, you got to be looking a long way down the line. We had to grow our grains and all that stuff. So he said, I don't want to make rye. And I said, why is that? And he goes, rye sucks. And I just laughed, and I said, well, hold on a second. I said, it doesn't really matter what you think or what I think, but, the consumers are starting to say that they want this. There was a demand. And he said, I don't want to make rye. Well, it took a lot of convincing of my partner Brad to believe that this was the right thing to do. And we had to twist the arm of a 6'5" master distiller who was in the Bourbon Hall of Fame and try to tell him to do something he didn't want to do. And that's a difficult task.
Of course, Steve got them back by making what he told them at the time was a rye whiskey, but it only had 48% rye in the mash bill when they checked it at bottling time, so it legally couldn't be called a rye whiskey. They are maturing a real rye whiskey in Wyoming now, and David told us they might just name it Steve in payback. But Pete, at Whiskey Ranker on Twitter, came up with this suggestion for a name. Might I suggest 6'5" Rye? It has a nice ring to it and gets your message across, in my opinion. Pete, I have to admit that's one of the best ideas I've heard in a while. And finally, Phil Collin at Derby City Phil in Louisville shared a photo with us this weekend on Twitter. It shows the spirit safe at Lux Row Distillers in Bardstown, silhouetted against the window with new make spirit bubbling up through it like a fountain. Here's his comment. Grabbed this shot when I toured the Lux Row Distillery in Bardstown last week. Their spirit safe is just mesmerizing to see in action. I could watch this thing spout off bubbling high-proof new make for hours. It really is a nice photo, and you can see it on our Twitter timeline. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all that other stuff that combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And let's go back to our lead story from the news, the Jim Beam Rickhouse fire this week near Versailles, Kentucky. Carl von Rimkus of El Paso, Texas, posted this comment on our Facebook page. I'm curious, was there no fire suppression system in the warehouse? The value of whiskey lost in the fire must be staggering. As I mentioned during the news, there is no official word from Beam Suntory on the value of the 45,000 barrels of whiskey lost in the fire, and I don't expect an official announcement anytime soon, especially since Beam Suntory does not have to release public financial statements as a privately held unit of Japan's Suntory Holdings. Now, if this had happened during Beam's days as a publicly traded company on the stock market, we would eventually see how much of a financial impact the fire had on the company's assets. There have been a lot of ballpark estimates in the media based on the estimated value of a barrel of whiskey, but in this case, I'm not inclined to rely on a ballpark estimate. Back to Carl's question, though. No, there was not a fire suppression system in that warehouse. We do not have the exact year it was built, but let's go back to a couple of weeks ago on Behind the Label, following the Rickhouse collapse at O.Z. Tyler Distillery, when I also mentioned Kentucky's safety standards for maturation warehouses. We know the Beam warehouse was built before Beam acquired the Old Crow Distillery and its warehouses in 1987, and that was well before Kentucky imposed new building codes for rickhouses following the 1996 Heaven Hill fire. The current standards require sprinkler systems in rickhouses, along with electrical and ventilation systems, as well as retention ditches and dikes around each rickhouse to keep spilled whiskey from flowing to other warehouses and spreading a fire. However, the state did not require that existing rickhouses be upgraded, and there are dozens of those older warehouses all over the state. It would likely be impossible to go back and retrofit all of those rickhouses with sprinklers, especially since the ones in rural areas would have to be connected to well water systems. and there's a legitimate question about whether wells could provide enough water pressure to knock down a warehouse fire, as well as the immense cost involved. Now, as for replacing those older ones, keep in mind that the bourbon industry is building new rickhouses as fast as they can just to keep up with current production, let alone having to find a place for the millions of barrels in those older rickhouses. What could change this? Well, it's not likely that the state of Kentucky can do much, since the current standards have been effective. There has not been an incident involving a post-1996 rickhouse to date. However, the insurance industry could step in. For instance, insurers could require that rickhouses have sprinkler systems in order to be covered by casualty insurance, or distillers might have to pay higher premiums to cover those older rickhouses based on a higher risk factor. For all we know, that might well be the case today. Those relationships between distillers and their insurance companies are proprietary and normally would never be available for public review unless they were to be disclosed as part of a hypothetical lawsuit over a rickhouse fire. Carl, I hope that answers your question, maybe with a little more detail than you were hoping for, though. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can find our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast. You'll also find the latest whiskey news, tasting notes, the whiskey photo of the week, and a complete archive of past episodes all the way back to 2005. I hope you'll take a minute this week to tell a friend about WhiskyCast. If you're not already subscribing to the podcast with Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app, take a minute this week and please click on the subscribe button. That way you won't miss a single episode. We love hearing from you. You can always get in touch with us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at WhiskyCast, and our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.